Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Guardian Live event. I'm Jonathan Freedland, columnist at The Guardian. And tonight I'll be speaking to my colleague, Tania Branigan, about her new and outstanding book, Red Memory. So Tania, as I said, colleague of mine, she's an editorial writer, leader writer for The Guardian. When it says The Guardian View and it's on foreign affairs, almost certainly it would have been written by Tania, formerly the Guardian's correspondent in Beijing, our China correspondent, and we're definitely going to be talking about that. Red Memory is a book that I've been recommending to everyone who will listen since I read it last autumn. I was lucky enough to read an advance copy. It is about the Cultural Revolution. It's not quite a history of the Cultural Revolution. It's a book that is somehow set in the past and in the present, and about how the past intrudes into and shapes the present, and therefore it's, well, to my mind anyway, it's going to be one of the big books of 2023. I think it's really outstanding. So Tania, welcome to this Guardian Live event. Thank you for doing it. Well, I'll say something about the housekeeping. You and I, Tania, are going to be talking for the first 40 minutes or so, and then we're going to bring in people who are watching, very keen to hear all of your contributions. Do start sending your questions in as soon as you have them via the Q&A button there at the bottom of your screen. Some of you have sent some excellent questions in advance already, and we will get to those. And I'll bring those in just as soon as we get to them. So you'll have noticed, Tania, I was quite sort of hesitant to define what the Cultural Revolution was, when it was, crucially, the death toll, because that's also a subject. So I thought right from the very beginning, I'm going to ask you to sort of define our terms and what was the Cultural Revolution, and what, in terms of lives lost and displaced, what its impact was on China.
It is extremely difficult to explain because it's such a complex and huge and long-lasting event. So as you said, it lasted 10 years. It broke out in 1966, unleashed by Mao, and it really ended only after his death in 1976. It saw around 2 million people killed, we think, and tens of millions persecuted, so many lives just wrecked. And at its heart, really, it was two things. Firstly, and most importantly, it was a power play. It was Mao's assertion of political supremacy again. So he had obviously led the Communist Party to victory. He'd been unquestionably, as some people put it, sort of China's last emperor in this position of really unchallenged authority. But in 1958, he launched the Great Leap Forward, which was this disastrous attempt to overhaul the economy and agriculture, to overtake the UK in industrial output, which was really, of course, an attempt to position China rather than the Soviet Union as the sort of the standard bearer for international communism. And it went disastrously wrong. It saw tens of millions of people starved to death across China. And it had to be reined back by pragmatists within the party. And so Mao very much felt that his authority had been challenged. His anxieties were increased by what he saw in the Soviet Union, where, of course, Khrushchev had denounced Stalin following Stalin's death. Then Khrushchev was removed. So there was very much concern from Mao, both for his immediate position, but also, I think, for his legacy. And then the second part, and what makes the Cultural Revolution particularly unusual, because of course the Communist Party had already seen a long history of purges and removal of anyone who sort of challenged Mao by this point, is that this time he turned outside the party. And so instead of internal political maneuverings, he launched a mass movement, particularly through young people, and we're talking children in many cases, young teenagers, launched this mass movement of sort of cultural rectification and purification. And these young gangs of Red Guards, who were really sort of political vigilantes, then went roaming through the land. They were attacking their teachers, they were attacking scholars, leaders, some of China's most famous artists and thinkers who would sort of die in the turmoil, burning treasures, tearing things down, destroying artworks, anything seemed to be deemed to be of foreign influence. And I think it was for Mao as well, a genuine belief that culture needed to be overhauled. So even when he came to power in China in 1949, he warned the communists that they had to be careful of what he called the sugar-coated bullets of the bourgeoisie. And this was this idea that communists would be seduced by power and seduced by their success, and it would be too easy to kind of enjoy material well-being and not challenge the things that communism was supposed to challenge. And so he used these young people to carry his revolution through, but it was in part as well genuinely ideological on his part. And because, of course, he used the masses, it swiftly became this movement that drew both on very real political zealotry at the time, but also inevitably on the other things that happen when you have any kind of mass movement, which is personal grudges, personal ambition, all the other things. And so the violence sort of spirals out of control, and we see Red Guards turning upon each other. We also sort of see families being murdered in the countryside and so forth. And then after a few years of this, even Mao really has had enough of this turmoil. He clamps down, the teenagers are dispatched to the countryside en masse, sort of 17 million of them will end up being sent to the countryside to live in these very remote places, thinking that they're going there for life. And we enter a more stagnant, more sort of stultified bureaucratic phase of the Cultural Revolution, but still a very deadly phase, in fact, in which we see many people purged and executed for their supposed political beliefs.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, as you describe in the book, it's like this sort of years-long fever and this rampage where people are just sort of propelled almost by, this passion. And one of the things that's most interesting, I think, in the book, I said at the top, it's not really a sort of history book because it's about how this stuff lives on in the present. And I want to get to that in a second, but just before we do, one of the things that makes it so complicated and why the book is so fascinating is it's not clear at all the boundary between victims and perpetrators. That normally, if we're talking about other great upheavals and deathly upheavals, we know who the killers are, and we know who the killed are. The thing that makes this so unusual is that sometimes it's the same people, and people move from one side to the other and back again in the course of a few years. Just explain that bit of the phenomenon.
I mean, this is what's so extraordinary, and in a large part, really, it's about Mao, his changeability, his ambiguity, the way that he pits people against each other, and his sort of changes of mind, his own sort of contradictions. There's a letter he writes to his wife just before the outbreak of the Cultural Revolution where he says, well, I'm both tiger and monkey, but it's the tiger in me that's dominant. So in other words, that authoritarian controlling figure, the ruler, is dominant, but there is what he calls his sort of monkey quality, which is this love of turmoil and upheaval, which he sees as being quite a sort of potent revolutionary force. So a lot of it comes down to the character of Mao, but also people seizing their opportunities to try and reassert themselves and save themselves, people not realizing that perhaps they're going to be in danger. So many of the sort of top leaders who are affected in the initial stages are quite happy to go along with purges and so forth until they realize it's actually coming round to them. And as you say, for so many people further down the scale, you could sort of flip between being victim and perpetrator very quickly. And one of the things that quite often fueled attacks was, I think, that people felt if you turned on somebody next to you, it might keep you a bit safer because you're saying, look, there's the counter-revolutionary over there. And so it was this very, very volatile situation in which there was really no stability and no sense of what made you an enemy. And this is obviously one of the things that makes it quite distinct to mass killings that you perhaps see in other countries in the 20th century, where a particular ethnic or religious group is targeted. In this case, it's never really very clear because mostly it's thought crimes or it's an accident of birth that gets you into trouble. And so you're never really very sure where you stand. And in fact, sycophancy itself is sort of the one thing that you can latch onto to try and survive or to try and maneuver your way in this environment. But then if you're too successful at it, Mao sees that in itself as quite dangerous. And so Lin Biao, who was the man who did more than anyone really to sort of promote the personality cult around Mao and cheer on the Cultural Revolution, himself falls victim before the Cultural Revolution is sort of half played out.
That's at the sort of leadership level, but what's so amazing is you have these gangs of teenagers who are all rampaging around, hunting down the counter-revolutionaries, beating up their own teachers, etc. And then they turn on each other and say, you're the counter-revolutionary, and suddenly they're all beating up one of, and then they're denouncing the denounced, and and so on. It's just this sort of, there's something a bit kind of Darwinian about it, where they're just turning, as I said, on each other. So let's talk a little bit about how you get to this, because you arrive in Beijing in that period around the Olympics, just in that sort of afterglow of that period, and it's obviously decades old by then, and yet somehow it's present in the China you find yourself in, and yet also hidden, both at once. And just talk us through both of those aspects, how you feel the presence of the Cultural Revolution in the China of, I suppose we're talking about the last decade when you were there, but also at the same time it's a sort of repressed memory.
So it's been a subject that has been sensitive for so long. It's never been wholly taboo, but it's always been very sensitive and very policed in discussion in China, and increasingly so over the years. So there was a period where it was quite helpful in a way for the authorities that in the immediate aftermath that people remembered why things had gone wrong, so that they could justify the turn to the market, moving away from Mao and turning their back on all those sort of communist ideals and moving towards the free market. But increasingly over time, they've sought to sort of clamp down on that discussion. And also because of the personal trauma involved. I mean, one of the things that was so striking for me that it really wasn't just about official suppression. A lot of it was ordinary people who'd lived through it, being unwilling to discuss it, even with members of their own family, and even in cases with members of their own family who had suffered through the same period. They still felt unable to talk about it somehow. At the same time, it just seemed to me that it was so close to the surface, and there were so many subjects. If you wanted to discover what gave a tycoon his drive, it really turned out to have been these experiences in the Cultural Revolution, that sense of individualism that really sort of took root in the era after the years where they'd been told it was all about sort of communist fraternity, but this sense you have to kind of make things work for yourself. If you talked to a film director about their relationship to culture and the way that their visual ideals, so much of it was linked to this kind of rupture within the culture when they were closed to foreign culture, and then there was this sudden sort of re-explosion where everything opened up again. And if you think about politics, very obviously, Xi Jinping is the most sort of obvious example of somebody who has clearly been so deeply shaped by his experiences. So his father was this revered revolutionary who was purged, was persecuted. She himself and the wider family then suffered in the Cultural Revolution. She's half-sister, ended up killing herself, we believe, because of the persecution the family had suffered. And he spent 7 years labouring in the countryside. And it's very clear that he has been deeply shaped by this experience. So really, wherever you look in China, it feels as if this is something that runs through the arts, through family relationships, even through the economy in some regards. It's just always present, and yet it's something that really people weren't willing to address for the most part. And what unites the people in the book is that they were the people who were willing to look back at that time and wanted to talk about it and try to understand it, because I think it's such a recent event, relatively speaking, and that's the extraordinary thing. And yet most people don't look back on it. And for those who do, there's quite a lot of nostalgia, actually. So it's a very, as much as it was a time of harshness and suffering, it's also a time that's regarded by some people with real sort of fondness.
And that's
so there's these layers of complexity there.
Very much. And the reason why the book takes you into these deeper places is because it isn't in a way about history, it is about memory, which is obviously a different thing. And it's about how these historic events are remembered and not remembered, how they're forgotten often deliberately. And you really peel that back in the present. So you're talking to people about how they are either do remember or deliberately don't remember experiences that happen to them. And that does inform you so much about the China of today. I just want to go back to one specific thing, because it can be, it's worth unpacking. When you mentioned about Xi Jinping and he's, labored in the countryside, to some people who don't know, that could sound quite bucolic. They imagine being a sort of goat herd in the countryside. The conditions people were in, just give us a sense of how unbelievably backbreakingly hard, the conditions he was in, but millions of others, you describe them. They are sort of rock bottom living conditions. And just give us a sort of sketch of what that meant to be exiled to the countryside.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it wasn't just that they didn't know if they'd see their parents again. And again, we're talking often about sort of 14-year-olds here. But they were really going back a sort of century in time, because they were going to places that didn't have running water or electricity. Maybe you couldn't reach them by road even. And they were hauling water from the wells just to drink or cook or wash. They were trying to sort of scratch a living on this land, really with no knowledge of farming. The farmers didn't really want them there because they weren't very good at producing food. They were just extra mouths to feed. People would die in work accidents, or they'd die of malaria or pneumonia, these sort of kids who are sort of stuck out there. And yet what is strange is that actually it's the one part of the Cultural Revolution that the authorities are willing to talk about and even celebrate, because they've repackaged it, as you say, almost as this sort of bucolic experience, a time that it was really tough and it was bitter. But look, Xi Jinping suffered through these years. He knows what it's like to be one of the ordinary people. He knows what it's like when times are tough. He's suffered. He obviously worked hard. And all of that, in a sense, is true. So it's a very sort of potent part of Xi Jinping's image now. But actually, interestingly, even ordinary people who lived through it do have a certain nostalgia for it. They have this very bittersweet feeling about it. So one of them said to me, well, I can't say I don't regret it, but in other ways, it was sort of like a treasure, this sort of experience of hardship that we went through, because it shaped us so deeply. And it's this very bittersweet, very ambivalent feeling that people have towards it.
The business of approaching people to talk about this, and was not straightforward. And you describe in the book how you really had to sort of track people down. You had to win their trust. Just tell us how reluctant people were to talk, and what and the sort of lengths you had to go to, or what it was that, if it, as it were, unlocked those memories. What did you say to people that did ready them to talk to you?
I mean, I think the first point is that they are all people who have chosen to remember the Cultural Revolution in some way and to keep its memory alive. And that was why I wanted to talk to them, because I was interested, as you say, in memory and what it means to remember. So they are all people who've done that to some degree, but because it can be sensitive in China and because it was traumatic for them, many people are understandably, they want to be in control of what they say and how they say it, which is very understandable. And so some people were not willing to talk when I approached them. And that's one important thing to say, that there were people I would have liked to have spoken to who decided in the end they didn't want to talk. And one of those people is even in the book, because I felt it was really important actually to reflect the fact that it's not just straightforward, that people have mixed feelings about whether they want to talk, that they had mixed feelings about whether they wanted to speak to a foreigner, partly because I think they thought it might be more sensitive, but also as an interviewee said to me, well, it's hard enough for us to understand. It's really hard. I don't really sort of see how foreigners can understand it, because there's so much sort of context to it. So people were cautious, and I felt it was important that I sort of reflected the fact that not everybody wanted to speak, particularly as the situation became tighter. But it was also possible in that period because it was a time when the authorities had taken a step back, and more importantly, I think, Chinese citizens and civil society had asserted themselves, had clawed out a space in which they could discuss relatively sensitive topics in the media. For example, there was a relative amount of space online. There was a lot of censorship going on even then, but there was some kind of space in which people could have meetings to talk about rights, religious groups had a bit more freedom, all of these things. And we really saw that change from around 2011, 2012. I mean, a lot of people link it to Xi Jinping, and there's no doubt that China has become much more repressive under his watch, but it did begin that tilt really around sort of 2011, even before he took power. And so while some of it was about him, I think a lot more of it was really about the party as a whole, although it's intensified under his watch. And I think it came in response to the Arab Spring and a number of other factors. But it just meant that that space that had been there for people to discuss these subjects really has become more and more hemmed in. And then particularly under Xi Jinping, because he's put such a focus on history, and so much of the party's mission now, particularly as economic growth falters and they can't keep saying we're making your life so much wealthier, so much of his mission has been about saying, look, the Communist Party has rescued China from these years of humiliation at foreign hands, including of course Britain, and we've brought it back to this position of greatness in the world. We've reasserted China's place. And so that's such a sort of central message for him that it's very important nothing undercuts that. And so other forms of history have been increasingly tightly policed. There's a hotline so people can call up and denounce acts of historical nihilism, for example. And he has really put it as being an historical nihilism as being an existential peril to the Communist Party, in the same way that, say, Western constitutional democracy is.
What would count as an act of historical nihilism in his definition?
So, for example, most obviously kind of criticizing great communist figures of the past, particularly Mao, sort of challenging accounts of sort of great communist deeds in history and so forth, things like this. But also, interestingly, sort of the document that sort of set all this out after he came to power talks about how people shouldn't distinguish between the sort of the pre and post Mao periods. So you're not really supposed to talk about the fact that there is this sudden turn from Mao to the market, which is really caused by the disaster of the Cultural Revolution. You have to sort of say, well, it's just this kind of great, smooth, sort of glorious progress under the Communist Party.
And one thing that's really striking in the book is you make clear that these changes from the top, they manifest themselves so concretely. You go at one point to a, as it were, private museum to the Cultural Revolution that at one point is accessible and then suddenly is very much not accessible. And, you know, roads have become, you know, all but closed to get there. The signs are down, the hours are limited. It's as if it was a place that was on the map and suddenly is sort of off the map. And then there's, I think you go to a museum where there's a really small, it's a big hall, but a tiny room for the Cultural Revolution. I think the room even gets smaller over time. It's hemmed in as if it's like a little corner of memory. And reading, I was thinking, okay, I get that the Communist Party wants to, present a best, the best version possible of itself. But this was so long ago. Why can't today's communist leadership say that was 50, 60 years ago? It's not on us. It seems that instead there is a feeling of direct continuity, as if today's leaders are responsible for what happened 50 or 60 years ago.
I mean, I think the underlying issue is the fact that in China, history has always been a sort of moral primer rather than just a sort of neutral record of accounts. So long before the Communist Party took power, it was used as a way to sort of reflect upon governance and the failings of the previous dynasty and so forth. And so history has a sort of a real resonance for the party, which has increased over time. And particularly because the disasters of the Cultural Revolution and then the crackdown on the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests really sort of just tore to shreds that idea of serving the people. So it had to offer something else. And so the historical narrative became more important. The argument that people often put in terms of why China can't repudiate Mao is that Mao is both Lenin and Stalin. So you can't say, he is the father of the revolution. You can't sort of say, well, it went a bit wrong at this point and let's boot this guy out of history, but we can return to the original founder and everything's fine. I actually think it's simpler or sort of deeper than that in a way, which is also that once you recognize that people have a right to criticize past leaders and criticize what the party's done in the past, you're implicitly granting them the right to challenge what you're doing now and question what you're doing now and why you're in charge rather than somebody else. So I think they recognize in that sense it is threatening for them.
So the brief window when it was allowed to be remembered was when they were quite keen for people to think that led to excesses and to violence, and therefore that's why we made the pivot to the market. But then as events went on, it became less and less convenient to talk about it. Just as an illustrative example, and then there's some bigger picture questions, but just tell us a little bit about the story of the woman you meet who was a schoolgirl in that school, which in a famous way turned on its teacher, just because it's sort of illustrative of the pattern in a way. What can you tell us about her, what she did in the past, but what she was like when you met her?
So one of the first victims, or the first victim, in fact, of the Cultural Revolution in Beijing was a teacher called Bian Zhongyun, who was killed by her teenage pupils. And this is a case that really became totemic, partly because her husband insisted on remembering and marking her death. I mean, initially secretly, he had to sort of remember her and record what had happened in secret. But then after Mao's death, in a more open way, he sort of sought justice. But it also became very important because it happened just before Mao held a grand rally for Red Guards in Tiananmen Square in August 1966. And up until then, the Red Guards had formed, but it wasn't it was partly a grassroots movement, and it wasn't entirely clear whether they'd have the approval of the leadership. Mao was given a red armband by one of the pupils from the teacher's school, and asked her name and said, oh, as in refined when he heard her name, and said instead, be Marshal. And so this was then emblazoned over all the propaganda that this woman was now named Yao, be Marshal, and that she'd put an armband on Chairman Mao. And so that was really the moment that made it clear that the Red Guards had Mao's approval and that they were to go out and do as they would. But of course,
and that they were in a way on this sort of stampede of violence in his name.
Yes, and so there were 2 deaths, I think, before the rally in Beijing, and there were hundreds in the days that followed. So huge numbers died in what became known as Red August because of the levels of violence. And so this woman really became seen as totemic of the guards, totemic of violence. She'd put up an initial poster criticizing the teacher, although in fact she was not involved in the beating that day, but people wrongly assumed that she had been. As she said herself, she became sort of totemic really of violence, of struggle. And finally, after many years of understandably being reluctant to talk about this, she came forward to apologize. But that apology was in itself hugely controversial, because I think this was such a totemic event, and because of the brutality of teacher Bian's death was so appalling, that it was never going to be possible really to satisfy, I suppose, everybody who heard it. And so rather than prompting the reconciliation that people had hoped for, it really in many ways turned into an argument, even among the people who wanted to talk about the past and talk about the Cultural Revolution, about what apologies meant, whether Red Guards who apologized were really sincere, what it would mean to be sincere, what people should do or say to apologize, how people could make recompense, if it's ever possible to make recompense for these events. And then of course equally people would say, well, these are the people who are willing to come forward and talk about it. And there were people who were murdering people in that time and have never spoken a word and never been named. So I think the case really just came to stand for the pain, the difficulty of addressing the past, the trauma that's attached to it for so many people, and just the difficulty of trying to address these subjects in a place where the authorities have never really allowed there to be free and open discussion. It would always, of course, have been difficult anywhere that we've seen these situations. It's extremely difficult to go through a process of truth and reconciliation, as we saw in South Africa, for example. But if you're in a situation where the authorities wish to control discussion so tightly, it becomes even harder. And then I do think as well, because it's become so hard, that in turn makes the authorities even more reluctant to address it. So although I think it is primarily a political issue for them, I think they do also worry about the impact of sort of opening the floodgates in that sense and having people talk about it, address it, reopen old wounds, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, we should say that even though you and I are now talking in sort of big picture terms, the thing that makes the book so the haunting is that it is told through these individuals and the individual stories. And you tell us the story of a couple who were together 50 years ago and then come back together as old people with these memories of the Cultural Revolution. You have teachers and pupils and people who were farmers and musicians, and it's their lives that you tell us about, which I think makes it so compelling. Before we go to the questions that people are coming in with, which are very good, I want to ask you a China-specific question and then a sort of universal question, and then we'll open it up. You speak quite scathingly in the book of contemporary China, not just about the government, but actually even as a society. You say, people are often individualistic or selfish, and a word I think you use more than once is cynical. There's a kind of cynicism in the society, which I think would be helpful if you describe what you mean by that, but also what role you think either the fact of the Cultural Revolution or the repression of the memory of the Cultural Revolution played in making this almost what you describe is almost like a national trait of a kind of cynicism, which, as I say, it would be helpful if you unpack for us what you mean by that.
Yes, I mean, in part, I think what I wanted to convey is that's how many Chinese people feel about the society. And as I do say in the book, I mean, I was also really struck there by how much generosity and kindness I saw, often in really difficult circumstances when people were making sort of great sacrifices or risks to help others out. And so many times I was struck by that. But certainly many people in China, when I was there, had this sense of things going wrong, of a sort of a crisis of social values, which perhaps in some sense you're always going to see in a place that is changing at breakneck speed. I mean, perhaps you might sort of draw comparisons with sort of Victorians and things, but for many people, they really did see it as being tied to the Cultural Revolution. And the fact that that was the point where you saw existing social structures really torn apart. So old ideals of Confucianism that had structured society, of filial piety and so forth, being sort of torn apart. Newer ideals of sort of communist fraternity again, because so many of these betrayals were very personal. It was a case of colleagues turning on colleagues and friends turning on friends and husbands turning on wives. And I think those really intimate betrayals really just did so much to destroy trust and create a more individualistic society, for better and for worse. I mean, some people would also say it's the fact it's a more individualistic place that means you wouldn't see a repeat of the Cultural Revolution. It's the fact it's more cynical that means people would not buy into that kind of political zealotry at the expense of humanity, perhaps. And that's the other side of it. But I think there is a great cynicism, a great sense of the dangers of trusting other people, of speaking your mind. And some of these things we can sort of trace further back in Chinese society in some ways, but I think so much of it really does relate to the Cultural Revolution and the destruction of that time.
The breaking down of trust is particularly interesting. The universal question I had was, because a theme that you and I have spoken about separately and that interests me a lot, having written about the Holocaust in the last year or so, is about intergenerational trauma. and the extent to which these wounding experiences affect even the generation after who didn't go through them directly. And you describe that in the book in a kind of physical way, even medical way. You just say something about that, that these, to me, that was an amazing thing, that there were incidences of sort of medical consequences of the Cultural Revolution, even a generation on.
Yes, I mean, as you say, most of the initial work on transgenerational trauma was really done with Holocaust survivors and their children, and now grandchildren, indeed. But it's something that people who've worked as psychotherapists in China or with Chinese people have particularly noted, seeing these effects play out, often, perhaps even especially, where people haven't talked about it openly. So, for example, I write about a case where an apparently sort of impeccable student suddenly writes this very graphic, visceral account of wanting to attack one of his tutors, and the university authorities get involved, and he goes to see a psychotherapist, and his family are called in. And the boy discovers what he's never known, which is that his grandfather was murdered in front of his father by Red Guards. And his father has never spoken a word about this, but has brought him up with this deep sense of distrust, of defensiveness, the idea that you can never allow any slight hint of anger to emerge. You have to bury any feeling of, any natural feeling of aggression or anger or rage that, in fact, ordinary people would have in their life. You have to bury it deep inside because it's dangerous to show it. And it's led the child clearly to this crisis point. But I suppose the one hope that one also takes from this is that there are loving, supportive parents who are trying their very best to get over those scars. In some cases, particularly among younger people, that they are willing to talk to professional help, which is something very much that almost none of the older generation, very, very few, are really willing to do. And so I did see hope there as well. And hope, as I said, in the willingness of people to address the past and take responsibility for what they had done.
Yeah. So let's go to questions that people have been sending over. Some of them do, touch on things we've already talked about. But Edward, for example, says, the Cultural Revolution happened not so long ago. It's within living memory, as we've been saying. Do people who went through the horror of that time still remember it today in China? We've talked about that. How is it talked about? Are there any places for commemoration of all those who died? That's slightly different from what I was asking about the museum. Those who lost people, are there places they can go to commemorate the people they lost?
Not really, no. There is one Cultural Revolution cemetery, which is in Chongqing, where victims of the factional fighting were buried, which still stands because other Cultural Revolution graveyards were razed. But in fact, that is no longer open for visits, apparently. I don't know if relatives of the people buried there can still go in, but certainly other visitors can no longer go in, whereas they could do previously. So even that has sort of been policed and shut down. And I think, in a sense, the big purpose of the Cultural Revolution Museum that I write about visiting was to create a memorial rather than a sort of historical institution in that sense. But again, that's something that really has been shut down in the last few years. It was allowed to operate as long as it sort of remained in obscurity. It became harder for it to operate when people actually started going, and that's, as Jonathan said, when people sort of took away the signposts and things, and then now it's been shut down. So there is less and less space, really.
A member watching tonight, audience member watching tonight, says, do you think there's been any coming to terms with the legacy of the Cultural Revolution, which I think you've addressed, but then goes on to say, do you think a truth and reconciliation process, which you did mention in South Africa, do you think a truth and reconciliation process is needed in China?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think what became clear to me is, as I said, it would be very hard to have it in an environment in which there are so many subjects you simply can't discuss. So I don't see how it could really happen in the China of today. I think it could be useful, but I think these things have to be handled with great care, because I think when I came to the subject, one sort of thinks of truth and reconciliation. It sounds great. Let's talk honestly and then repair the damage. But in fact, when you start to address the truth, as you saw in South Africa, it is extraordinarily painful for people. And there were some extraordinary achievements in that process, but it was also in itself a very difficult and painful process for people to go through. Yeah. So it's one that has to be handled with the utmost care as well.
And also needing it doesn't mean it's going to happen. I mean,
no,
even if people do need it. Several people have picked up on this point about nostalgia, which I know you did speak about. And Darren says, having lived in Beijing for 8 years, I was surprised to encounter several survivors of the Cultural Revolution who felt generally positive about their experiences. How do you account for this phenomenon? And then Seth also asks, you mentioned that many people are nostalgic. What exactly were they nostalgic about?
I mean, I think one thing, and this applies everywhere, you can see it in the UK as well, is that our view of the past is often as much about our view of today as it is about the past itself. And so for many people, sometimes for political reasons, because they're still Maoist, but sometimes for sort of broader social, personal reasons, they see that past as being somehow purer, having more meaning, having more social interaction. It doesn't have the sort of the corruption that they've seen in China more recently, that there were social, even things like having social spaces, for example. So you would get these kind of model operas being performed. And it's like, well, here was an art form that was performed in a public space and we could all go along and watch. And now everything is sort of privatized and you have to go to a shopping center. For example, I mean, it sounds sort of odd or perhaps even trivial to us, but people sort of felt, there was a space where we could gather. There were things that we were doing together. And obviously, not everybody was persecuted in the Cultural Revolution. Some people weren't affected. Even sort of people who went through terrible times feel that they sort of somehow found meaning. You could argue perhaps emotionally they feel they have to find some reason, have to find some meaning in what they went through. But as I said, with the educated youth who were sent down to the countryside, many of them now have this way of looking at it as sort of saying, well, this was the era that forged us. And there's a sort of certain nostalgia. And of course, I mean, think about something like The Waltons, which is about Depression era America, or think about something like Blitz Spirit, it was a mass bombing campaign. I mean, we're not immune to these things either. And that was sort of something I wanted to make clear in the book, that we all have quite skewed versions of our own history. We all have sometimes deliberately dishonest versions of our history, but also that our view of what happened to us in the past is also sometimes about seeking meaning and identity in the present.
Yeah, this is where I think it gets, as I said, it's human and universal what you're talking about there. And people are just nostalgic for their childhood and their youth, even if it was desperately poor, starving, violent and unhappy. It was their youth, and therefore people do look back on that and sort of somehow feel some sort of longing for it.
And it was more equal as well. I mean, I think,
yes.
There is a sort of genuine thing, which is that China just became so incredibly unequal with its pace of development, this gulf between the cities and the countryside, the gulf between the rich and the poor that was so visible, people having to walk past Maseratis on the street when they're thinking about how to sort of feed their kids. It's a very potent thing to look back and think, well, we were, in their view, sort of, we were all in it together, really. Yes, now, obviously, there are many people who don't feel remotely nostalgic for the Cultural Revolution, but there is a certain argument, which is that many of the sort of accounts we have, the memoirs of the Cultural Revolution, are obviously written by the people who suffered most, and people say, well, they were the elite before. Of course they had a bad time, but what about us? Maybe it wasn't so bad for us.
Leo asks, how does the collective memory of the Cultural Revolution and its treatment among the Chinese, particularly, I suppose, this point about repression, compare to that of other countries who've been through a fratricidal war like Cambodia or Rwanda? To what extent is their attitude shaped by traditional cultural mores, Confucian values perhaps, versus ongoing totalitarian political strictures? So what I take away from that is, in a way, this thing of repressing the memory of this horribly traumatic and violent period. To what extent is that just what societies that have gone through civil wars, as it were, and internal violence just they do that, they repress that memory, or how much is this a Chinese thing?
That is such a good question. And I became very interested in sort of how other cultures look at these questions. I mean, we talked a little bit about South Africa and that attempt to have a sort of an honest reckoning with what had happened. I do think a lot of it is tied to the politics making it impossible to address it. But I do also think that the scale of it and the fact that it involved so many sort of personal betrayals between people who were working together, as I said, within households even, children turning on parents, made it very hard to address. And so much of it is about the personal trauma as well. So I think some of it is sort of inherent within the Cultural Revolution, really. But I think there are definitely factors that are common to other sort of crises we've seen elsewhere.
So we've got a couple of very specific questions. So we'll start with David. In what ways does the suppression of Christianity during the Cultural Revolution continue to impact on China? Just on that one.
It's fascinating that actually we saw this huge sort of explosion of interest in faith. Ian Johnson's book, The Souls of China, is very interesting on the sort of that passionate search for meaning and identity that we saw, partly as a result of the Cultural Revolution and the sort of the crushing of values then. And also, I think, just because of that extraordinary capitalist transformation, which again, in itself left people trying to look for values and meaning. And so we saw this real thriving of religion of all kinds, including Christianity in China. But again, we've seen this growing repression in recent years, and there's been a real crushing of the independent sort of underground churches, as they're called, and the religious sphere, like so many others. I mean, you look at academia, business, even entertainment, they've all been kind of brought back under party control in a way that they hadn't been, or for a long time, or they'd enjoyed at least a degree more autonomy.
And similarly specific question, did you come across any LGBT plus histories and how this informs LGBT plus lives in China today? Was there a specific dimension there in terms of sexuality of those persecuted in the Cultural Revolution?
Not as far as I know, and that's such an interesting question. I would love to know. I mean, I write a little bit about the fact it was quite a puritanical time generally. So, you know, people were not supposed to be, it's a point where the party controls who gets married and who gets divorced. You needed permission from your work unit. So the party inserted itself into every personal relationship. I think there would have been astonishingly few people who were able to be openly gay or lesbian at that time. And again, recently, we have seen, as part of the sort of state's growing repression, a real clampdown on LGBTQ sort of discussions within China, groups being sort of repressed, brought into line, discussion being muzzled online, and so forth. So many of these things are now much more sensitive territory than they were 10 years ago, for example.
Yeah, I think you say at some point in the book, if you were starting on the process of the book now rather than concluding it, it would be impossible for you to do it.
Yes, and I really feel that so much space has been closed off. And as I say, it's really, the party did retreat from certain spheres, but it's also really important to remember that a lot of very brave and determined people in China also set out to carve out a space for civil society, a place where discussion was possible, you know, within the media, that there was more discussion of difficult issues. And so much of that has really disappeared. That space has just gone now.
It's very tempting when people read these sorts of books to assume as they're reading, well, they would have been on the side of the goodies and they would never have joined the rampaging mob, you know, who were wreaking havoc and violence, and they would have sat it out. You say something really interesting early on in the book. You say the Cultural Revolution was a time of impossible moral choices, a time when you could not do the right thing because there was no right thing to do. This goes to this confusion about what the orthodoxy of the day was, which might change tomorrow. And then you say, worse, I recognize in it the youthful Roundhead, capital R, thirst for purity. And I read into that word recognize in it that you yourself sort of know something of being the young person with that kind of zeal for, well, purity. Just say a bit more about that, and to what extent you are being you're speaking about something personal there.
I just really wanted to acknowledge, I think, as you say, people always assume they're on the side of the goodies. I remember a friend saying to me that everybody thinks they would have been in the resistance if they lived in France, and clearly most people weren't.
Right.
So I think it's so easy for people outside to criticize and challenge. And I've sort of even seen it when people are talking about decisions made by dissidents in China, for example. Well, they shouldn't have done it this way, or maybe that wasn't a good decision. And I just think it's so impossible for us to imagine what it would have been like to be growing up in that time when you were taught to revere Chairman Mao and to follow what he told you. You were brought up to believe your country and everything sort of pure that it stood for was under threat. Chairman Mao, in the words of a song, mother and father are dear, but Chairman Mao is dearer. You were supposed to revere him, love him. You were brought up in a very sort of martial culture, which was all about how the communists had to battle about the sort of the purity and struggle of revolution. You had these great revolutionary ideals, and yet while your parents perhaps had actually fought, you'd never been able to put this into action, and suddenly you were being called to arms. So I think even at the very beginning, it's extremely hard to judge those young people, these children, for the decisions they made. They say they have to take responsibility, but I really wanted people to think about what they might have done in that situation, how seductive perhaps it might have been to hear those things. And then, as you say, as it went on and it became more and more complex, there were so many situations where there really wasn't a right or wrong. I mean, you sort of talk to people, for example, who had to think about whether to stand by their husband when he was denounced. And someone said to me, well, I thought I might be killed as well, and I thought my children might turn away from me, probably to sort of save themselves. And you think, well, if you're a mother, do you stand by the man you married who has done nothing wrong, but maybe risk losing your children or putting your children's futures in peril? Or do you walk away? And I just think, how would anybody make these kinds of decisions and be sure that they were making the right one?
Yes, I was picking up on this phrase. I recognize in it the youthful roundhead thirst for purity, as if you were perhaps saying something about yourself that even as a teenager, there is something about the doctrinaire and the dogmatic.
Yes,
young people can be quite extreme. So you recognizing some of that in yourself.
Yeah, I think young people want meaning, and they're quite idealistic, basically. Yes. Young people often want a cause, don't they?
Yeah. No, let's with some really good questions coming in. This one fascinates me. An audience member asks, how did Maoists in Europe react to the Cultural Revolution? Lots of leftists in Britain in the 60s and 70s identified themselves as Maoists. There would have been lots in France and elsewhere. How did they react to word coming out that, between 500,000 and perhaps 2 million people were being killed, and in the most brutal way? Did that break their faith in Mao or not?
Well, as you say, there was a great deal of enthusiasm at the start. I mean, in many ways, it seems like such an anomaly because you sort of, think that this was while the Beatles and sort of James Bond movies and things were going on. But obviously, it was a time when there was a great interest in sort of revolution and counterculture around the world. Julia Lovell's book on Maoism, A Global History, is sort of great on this. And what's interesting is that people sort of didn't want to believe, I think, when especially Pierre Ryckman, the sort of very famous sinologist who was one of the first to write pretty scathingly about what he saw in the Cultural Revolution, he really received so much flack for that. People didn't want to believe it. And there's this extraordinary story, which sounds made up, I know, of Deng Xiaoping after the Cultural Revolution meeting Shirley MacLaine at this sort of White House banquet. And she says to him, oh, I met this scientist and he sort of told me how much better it was when he was labouring in the fields because he learnt so much from being sort of sent into exile in the countryside. And Deng just turns to her and says, he lied. But there was still that sort of willingness on the part of the left to believe that there had been some greater good served by it. And perhaps just because it was so awful, people want to sort of think that there was some worth or value, that there must have been something there.
Yeah, but this goes round and round, doesn't it, with the communists in the 30s about the Soviet Union not wanting to believe. we've got a few minutes left to mop up a few last really interesting questions. During the culture, somebody watching tonight says, during the Cultural Revolution, people left China for Hong Kong and then the UK. The younger Chinese and Hong Konger diaspora communities here, looking to their roots, find that their parents and elders refuse to talk about that time. Might you have any suggestions on how these second-generation Chinese might be able to find out more firsthand?
I think if you want to know about your own family's history, that is extremely hard, because I know that so many people just aren't willing to talk about it. And I can understand why. I mean, it's been so dangerous to talk about. In some cases, older people are willing to talk outside the country. That was something that a psychotherapist working abroad had said to me, that he'd had people who'd said, oh, finally, I can discuss this thing that happened to me 50 odd years ago. For the first time, because I'm physically out of China. So that might be one thing, if relatives are still willing to travel. I think the subject can be delicately broached, but it is so hard. I don't know if I don't know whether we should be talking to older people about this, but there is just a wealth of material out there, often by Chinese scholars and researchers, both inside and outside China. So there is a huge amount of material to read more generally, which might reflect your family's circumstances, I think.
Yeah, but it's fascinating for me to hear you say that it's very hard even for a child to get their own parents to talk about it. That I thought you were going to say very hard to get a stranger to open up. You're saying a son or daughter might find their mother or father just won't talk about what happened to them.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And even those who've addressed it sometimes, someone I'd talked to about the Cultural Revolution and had told me quite a lot about their family history, and then said after reading the book, they'd had a sort of discussion with a family member who'd suddenly told them a fairly major part of the story that they had just never revealed in all these years,
Yeah, I think your book will be a prompt, actually, for people to talk. I think it will have an effect. Let's just go in our closing minutes with questions about China now, partly in the light of this. We've got 2 or 3 minutes. I'll give you 2 or 3 of them and you can choose which ones to go with. Has researching the Cultural Revolution informed your view, I suppose, of how the Chinese government responded to the pandemic? Do you have any thoughts regarding the future direction of the Chinese government? Could there be another Chairman Mao? Or could there be a Chinese Rosa Parks or Gandhi or Nelson Mandela who could advocate for social change and progressive values? So that's a kind of what happens next. Interesting question there about COVID. And then David asks, China was often characterized as not being imperial, not expansionist, not warlike. Do you agree that this is liable to change with Xi Jinping holding such concentrated power? And then same sort of, they're all in the same area. Can you see Xi Jinping making old bones, that phrase, like Mao, or can he be overthrown by a populace fed up with all his various curbs on freedom, for example, the COVID response? So people asking, how long does Xi Jinping stay in power? What might he do with that power? Could it involve war? And is there, does he turn into another Mao figure himself? And what possibility is there for, well, you might call it dissent or opposition or even resistance?
I would say there have been some extraordinarily brave sort of civil activists within China. Most of them have either left or been locked up, to be honest. In terms of Xi Jinping's tenure, I think a growing number of people, not the people I speak to in my book, in fact, many of whom were sort of very positive about Xi Jinping when I spoke to them, certainly, but people in China now have drawn comparisons with that era. So we've seen a very brave scholar do that. He subsequently lost his job after sort of talking about a new personality cult, which was not a very hidden reference. More recently, actually, with the COVID protests, we had people holding up a few signs saying we want reform, not the Cultural Revolution. And I think in that very tough handling of COVID, people actually did see parallels with the very sort of strict incursions on life that happened in the Cultural Revolution. So people did see parallels there, and it made them think a lot about where the country is headed.
Well, you have, like a true pro, talked us right up to the hour. We have run out of time. That is the end of our time. I hope that Tania was able to answer almost all your questions. We did manage to get through a lot of them. Really, really good quality questions from all of you. So thank you for that. The book is Red Memory. And let me give you the full title because it's a very good subtitle. It's Red Memory, Living, Remembering and Forgetting China's Cultural Revolution. You can get that from the Guardian bookshop. You can read Tania's long read, which I think is an extract from the book, at theguardian.com. To find out more about future Guardian Live events, do visit theguardian.com/Guardian Live. Thanks to all of you for joining us this evening, and especially to those of you who sent in questions. We always love to hear from you what you thought of the event, so please do fill in the survey that is going to pop up automatically at the end of this. Before I say thank you to Tania, I'm just going to say again, it really is a very special book, and I recommend it very, very highly. Even if you don't think you're interested in China, it does have these other sort of universal questions about memory, about history, and about how trauma can reverberate through the generations. So I do recommend it really strongly. But finally, a very, very big thank you to you, Tania Branigan.
Thank you so much.